I am sorry I could never show this lair to you. The lair is a secret that's been passed down for over 100 years. And there are rules. You remember when you were a teenager? All the training, the drills, all of it was to prepare you for this. I know you have it in you, Leon.
Fear has a very specific architecture. Most people think of it as something that rises in you, spontaneous, ungoverned, a reaction to something real and immediate. But the most durable fear, the kind that outlasts a single encounter and settles into the bones of a culture, doesn't work that way. It has to be built. It has to be designed around what people already believe about the dark, and then placed there carefully, like a lamp that burns on a fuel they can't identify, and therefore cannot extinguish. The Mantis is the most complete example of this in the settled systems. Not the most violent, not the most powerful, but the most deliberately constructed. A legend that has been circulating among pirate crews and spacer gangs for long enough that its origins have blurred into something that feels, to the people who fear it, like it was always there. Like it emerged from the darkness between worlds, the way darkness tends to produce things, without explanation, without beginning, without a face you could put a name to. But it has a face. It had a name, and the woman who became the Mantis was not a product of the dark at all. She was someone who understood the dark well enough to use it, someone who looked at the vast unpoliced space between colony worlds and saw not just a problem, but a canvas. She didn't stumble into legend. She calculated her way into it, with the kind of patience and precision that most people spend on careers and relationships and ordinary life, directed instead toward a single, consuming project, the construction of something that would outlive her. That is the quiet contradiction at the heart of this story. The Mantis is spoken of in hushed tones by people who believe they are talking about a natural phenomenon, something that simply exists, like the radiation between stars or the cold of an airless moon. But nothing about the Mantis is natural. Every detail was chosen. Every element of the mythology was tested against the question, will this make someone afraid? Will this fear travel? Will this survive me? Those are not the questions of a soldier or a mercenary or a vigilante in the traditional sense. They are the questions of a strategist who has decided that the most powerful weapon available in the settled systems is not a railgun or a nuclear warhead or a fleet of warships. It is a story, believed deeply enough, maintained carefully enough, released into the right channels at the right times, and then allowed to grow on its own, the way all good stories grow, by being passed from one frightened mouth to the next, gathering weight with every repetition. And this is where the central question lives, not who was the Mantis. That question has an answer, and we will arrive at it, but something harder. What does it mean that she was right? That the legend she built not only survived her, but kept working, kept traveling, kept producing the fear she designed it to produce, long after her hands were no longer guiding it? What does that say about the settled systems, about the darkness they contain, and the human capacity for engineering meaning out of it? That is the question this story is really asking. The name is just where we begin. To answer it, we have to go further back than the legend. We have to go to the conditions that made the legend possible, to the structural reality of the settled systems that the Mantis was responding to when she decided to build something designed to outlast her. Because the most important context for understanding what she created is not her psychology, impressive as that is. It is the geography, the sheer, staggering, ungovernable scale of space itself. The United Colonies and the Freestar Collective are, in many respects, genuinely impressive institutional achievements. They have built functioning societies across multiple star systems. They have established law, commerce, governance, the whole scaffolding of civilization, in an environment that fights continuously against the idea of civilization. But they have an irreducible weakness built into the physics of their situation. The distance between colony worlds is not like the distance between cities. You cannot maintain law enforcement presence everywhere across light years of space. You cannot patrol the dark. The resources required to project authority across interstellar distances are staggering, and neither faction has ever had enough of them to fill the gaps between their settled worlds. The Spacers and the Crimson Fleet and every other criminal organization that operates in the outer systems understands this with the clarity of long practical experience. They don't operate in the gaps between colony worlds because they're hiding. They operate there because that space is genuinely, structurally theirs. The law runs to the edge of what it can afford to reach, and then it stops. Beyond that line, violence is the primary currency, and power flows entirely to whoever is willing to use it without institutional constraint. Into that context, one woman decided to introduce something different. Not a new institution, not a fleet, not a formal enforcement mechanism, a story. And the fact that she chose that tool, that she looked at the scale of the problem and concluded that the most efficient solution was mythological, tells you, before you know anything else about her, that she understood the terrain she was working in at a level most people never achieve. Every legend needs an entry point, a place where the mythology becomes accessible to ordinary people who weren't present for the original events. For the Mantis, that entry point is not a scholarly document or a warning broadcast across the settled systems. It is a note, a message found on the body of a dead spacer, scrawled in the practical urgency of someone who believed they had just gotten very lucky information. It reads like a tip passed between criminals. Go to Denebola I-b. There's a secret outpost worth cracking open, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The kind of breathless communication that moves through pirate networks the way all valuable intelligence moves, fast, imprecise, and stripped of context. What that note doesn't say, and what whoever wrote it almost certainly didn't understand, is that the outpost they were describing wasn't a cache or an abandoned weapons depot or any of the ordinary scores that spacer crews spend their careers chasing. It was a test, one that had been running undetected for as long as Doriane Voclaine had been building the Mantis, a test for a specific person, constructed with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything else, waiting for whoever was serious enough to complete it. That the note circulates among spacer crews at all tells you something essential about how the Mantis myth actually propagates. It doesn't travel through channels Doriane controlled. It travels through the people she was fighting, through the criminal networks that have spent years trying to locate her base and failing, who have accumulated fragments of knowledge about the Mantis that are just detailed enough to be tantalizing and just incomplete enough to be dangerous. The spacers carrying that note are not acolytes of the legend. They are looters, and in trying to loot the Lair, they become the mechanism by which anyone who encounters them, anyone who kills a spacer and checks their pockets and notices the note, gets pulled toward Denebola. The Mantis had become for pirate culture what certain natural phenomena are for people without access to meteorology. Unexplained, unchallengeable, something that arrives and leaves according to its own logic, and against which the appropriate response is simply to hope you aren't in its path. And yet, here were spacers trying to crack open her home like a safe, which suggests that the fear, however real, had a limit, that greed is always willing to negotiate with terror when the stakes seem high enough. The note leads to the Denebola system, to a moon designated Denebola I-b, and to a man named Doriane Voclaine, whose connection to the Lair is inseparable from what the Mantis really was and what it ultimately cost her, not just in the currency of danger and secrecy, but in the quieter, harder currency of a life lived at an angle to everything ordinary. Denebola is a bright star in the constellation Leo. If you're positioning yourself relative to Earth, which in the settled systems is a reference point that still carries weight, even though most of the people living in those systems have never set foot there. From a functional navigational perspective, the Denebola system is simply another set of coordinates in the vast catalog of explored space, catalogued, filed, largely unremarkable. The moon designated 1b is the kind of place that shows up on surveys and then gets quietly ignored by everyone with somewhere better to be. Airless, cold in the deep, indifferent way that uninhabited bodies are cold, not hostile exactly, but entirely unconcerned with whether you live or die on its surface. The facility the Mantis built there does not announce itself. No lights visible from orbit, no transmissions, no navigation beacons. It sits in the landscape the way a buried thing sits, present for those who know to look, invisible to everyone else. From the surface, the approach is long enough to feel like the place is testing your patience before you've even arrived. And then you step inside, and the first thing that happens is that your assumptions reorganize. The lair of the Mantis is not what the legend would prepare you for. It is not a fortress in the dramatic sense, not a monument to violence or a shrine to the myth that had been built around its creator. It is something more human and more unsettling than either of those things. It is a place that has been lived in, worked in, the kind of space that develops a particular quality of air when the same person has occupied it for years, thinking the same sustained and difficult thoughts, and occasionally writing them down in the margins of documents stacked on surfaces that were once organized and have since become archaeology. Doriane's computer is still accessible in the control center, her files intact, her correspondence preserved in the casual way that people preserve things when they assume they will come back to them. A log titled "You've Earned It" sits among the entries, addressed to Leon. Reading it, you are holding the end of a conversation that the other participant never reached. She wrote to her son. He came to read it. He never got far enough. The engineering throughout is precise and carefully considered. Someone with genuine technical expertise designed this place, not just as a hideout, but as a system. Every element serves multiple purposes. Storage is also concealment. Corridors are also kill zones. The power systems were built to run indefinitely without external maintenance, which means the facility is still fully operational at the time of discovery. Lights on, automated systems cycling through their routines, defenses active and attentive and willing to kill anyone who wanders into the wrong place without the right credentials. That last detail is worth pausing on. The Mantis built her home expecting to be gone from it for extended periods, and she built it to keep running faithfully in her absence, to protect itself, to remain ready, to behave as though its creator might return at any moment, even when she couldn't. There is something almost melancholy in the thoroughness of that preparation. It is the work of someone who understood that the gap between missions might be long, who made sure that what she had built would still be intact when she came back, and who probably, at some level, also understood that someday she wouldn't come back at all. The automated defenses that patrol the corridors are not hostile to anything in particular. They're hostile to everyone who hasn't been specifically granted access. They fire on intruders with the same even-handed efficiency they would have brought to the task years ago. There is no deterioration, no forgetting, no modification based on the long absence of the person who programmed them. They are exactly what they were designed to be, still executing those designs faithfully after all this time. Robots and turrets, operating on schedules and threat assessments that were written by someone who is gone, continuing to act in her name. It is, in miniature, an image of the whole legend, a design that keeps running without a living hand to maintain it. The most famous trap in the Mantis's lair is the floor. Not famous in the way that most traps are famous, for their dramatic scale or the number of people they've killed. Famous because of what it asks you to do. A long corridor lined with marked panels, most of which are lethal, arranged in a pattern that doesn't immediately reveal itself. The wrong step drops you. The right steps trace a path, and the path, viewed from above, spells something out. Tyrannis, the Latin word, or rather the Latin root, for tyranny. Not the dramatic English rendering of the concept, with all its associations with cliched villainy, but the precise Roman-derived term, the word the ancient world used for rule without legitimate authority, for power that answers to nothing outside itself, for governance that has broken the implicit contract between those who lead and those who are led. Tyrannis, in the Roman understanding, was specifically about the corruption of the relationship between ruler and subject, the moment when authority stops serving those beneath it and begins consuming them. She could have chosen any word. She could have chosen justice, simple, aspirational, the kind of word that tends to appear in the iconography of people who see themselves as heroes. She could have chosen her own name, a territorial marker, the kind of claim that human beings make on spaces they want to define as theirs. She could have chosen something from the history of the settled systems, a reference to a battle or a political principle, or one of the dozens of ideological frameworks that the competing governments of the colonized worlds use to justify their existence. She chose the name of the thing she was fighting, This is not a small decision. Building the key to your home's threshold out of your enemy's nature is a statement about how you understand yourself in relation to that enemy. She did not define herself by what she stood for, not by justice or freedom or any of the affirmative identities that vigilante mythology tends to reach for. She defined herself by what she stood against, by the specific shape of the wrong she had committed herself to fighting. The floor of her home says, "This is what I know. This is what I have named. This is the thing I wake up every morning having decided to spend myself on." There is a hardness to that choice that you only get from someone who has looked at the problem long enough to stop being idealistic about it. Idealism reaches for what should be. The word Tyrannis is not about what should be. It is about what is. It is a perfectly clear-eyed acknowledgement that the enemy is real and specific and has been operating for a very long time and will not stop simply because someone opposes it. It is a daily reminder, built into the architecture of the place where she lived, of exactly what she was dealing with. The puzzle also functions as a filter in ways that go beyond simple security. Any intruder who reaches that corridor without understanding the answer will either die or retreat. But the answer is not hidden in some external trail or outside document. It is hidden in plain sight, inside the lair itself, in Doriane's own voice, recorded on intercoms and data slates that play throughout the descent. Her catchphrase, repeated in those recordings, is Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, the phrase she lived by, the phrase she apparently said so often that her son Leon found it irritating enough to record his own exasperation with it in one of his audio logs. The word Tyrannis is extracted directly from that phrase. Her motto, her creed, the thing she kept saying because it named the principle she had organized her entire existence around. Sic Semper Tyrannis carries a weight in human historical memory that she clearly understood and chose deliberately. It is the phrase attributed to Brutus at the assassination of Julius Caesar, though historians debate whether he actually said it. It was reportedly spoken by John Wilkes Booth after shooting Lincoln. It is the official motto of Virginia. It recurs, across centuries, at the moments when someone decides that a ruler has exceeded the legitimate boundaries of power and must be removed. The phrase does not describe a political theory. It describes a pattern, a recurrence, the way history's most extreme concentrations of unchecked authority tend to end, always, inevitably, by being overturned. That she built this phrase into the threshold of her home as the key that opens it is not a small detail about her character. It is the character. She was not just fighting criminals. Based on what we can infer from everything else in the lair, the precision of the engineering, the deliberateness of every choice, the intercoms addressing her son with the phrase she repeated like a liturgy, she understood herself as part of a longer pattern, one link in a chain that stretches back further than the settled systems, forward into whatever comes after them. Not a hero, an instance of a recurring human reflex, the refusal to let tyranny stand, expressed in whatever form the current moment makes possible. Which means the test is not about what you know coming in. It is about whether you listened on the way down, Whether you paid attention to the recordings that most people in a hurry would walk straight past. Whether you treated the Lair as a communication rather than an obstacle. The answer was always there, in her voice, offered to anyone who was willing to be patient enough to receive it. Tyrannis. Walk through it, step by step, letter by letter, and know what you're walking through. The right person will understand. That was what she was counting on. The recordings in the Lair are not the records of a myth. They are the records of a person, someone whose voice, listened to across however many years, separate the moment of recording from the moment of discovery, carries the particular quality of someone who has been alone with their thoughts long enough that those thoughts have become unusually organized, precise without being cold, certain without performing certainty. What emerges from those recordings and from the documents and the physical evidence of the space itself is the portrait of a woman with a background that sits at an uncomfortable intersection. She was educated, technically accomplished, possessed of the kind of systemic intelligence that can look at a complex network of operations and identify its structural logic from the outside. The recordings suggest someone who understood criminal networks from the inside out, who knew how they thought, what they valued, where their operational confidence came from, whether that understanding came from proximity to that world, from some professional history working adjacent to it, or simply from a long and rigorous study of it from the outside. The game doesn't fully resolve. What it does make clear is that she arrived at vigilantism not in ignorance of the machinery she was fighting, but with an unusually precise map of it. That precision is important. It is what separates the Mantis from the simpler archetype of the outraged individual who decides to do something. She didn't arrive at vigilantism from the outside, from the perspective of someone who knows that something is wrong but doesn't understand how it operates. She arrived with the understanding that comes from having seen the machinery clearly enough to know exactly which pressure points produce the most disproportionate results. The insect she chose as her symbol was not a casual choice. The mantis, the real animal, the one with the triangular head and the serrated forelegs, and the remarkable stillness that precedes violence, sits in a specific part of human perception that most predators don't occupy. Most predators are recognizable as dangers because they look like the things we associate with danger: large, fast, toothy. The mantis is unsettling in a different register. It is still for a very long time. It watches with what appears at a purely visual level to be intelligent attention, and then it moves with a speed that is completely inconsistent with the patience that preceded it, in a way that the prey has no time to process before the outcome is decided. That is the psychological profile she was building for herself. Not overwhelming force. She did not have overwhelming force available to her. She had precision, patience, and the capacity to appear to be in far more places at once than she actually was. She was working largely alone, and working alone against organizations that have numbers and resources that no individual can match through direct confrontation. The only viable strategy was to become something that felt larger than it was, to project an omnipresence that she couldn't actually achieve physically, but could achieve through the imagination of the people she was targeting. The armor reinforces this precisely. It is not the armor of a soldier in the conventional sense. It doesn't read as military, doesn't suggest the institutions and hierarchies that military equipment tends to evoke. It reads as something else, at a distance, in the wrong lighting, in the particular context of someone who is already afraid and has heard the name Mantis spoken too many times in the dark. It reads as something that isn't quite human in the way that ordinary people wearing ordinary equipment looks human. It occupies the uncanny register, not alien, not monstrous, but shifted slightly off the baseline in a way that the brain registers before the conscious mind can interrogate it. She built a costume in the truest sense of that word, not a disguise. She wasn't trying to look like something else. She was trying to look like what the Mantis was supposed to be, a predatory intelligence, patient and precise, and operating according to its own logic in a space where most people are simply trying to survive. What she understood about costumes, about symbols, about the whole apparatus of performed identity, is something that the most effective institutions in human history have always understood, and the most effective criminals understand too. The perception of what you are does a significant portion of the actual work that being what you are requires. A uniform changes how a law enforcement officer is treated before they open their mouth. A ship's markings change whether a freighter captain considers running. A name repeated enough times in enough frightened conversations becomes a kind of presence that can be in places the physical person never goes. She was building presence at scale, distributing the Mantis across the imagination of her targets in a way that no individual could achieve physically. The suit and the ship and the name were all components of the same distribution mechanism, a system for ensuring that wherever criminals gathered to plan their next move, the Mantis would be somewhere in the room, uninvited and unphysical, sitting in the back of their minds and influencing the decisions they made without ever having to physically appear to enforce anything. The Razorleaf served as its own kind of weapon, a ship distinctive enough that any pirate who had heard the name, and by the time she had been operating for a few years, that was most of them, would recognize it on approach. And recognition means warning. Warning means time to be afraid before the confrontation even begins. She understood something important about how fear functions in practical terms. It works best before the event, not during it. A pirate crew that is already afraid when they see the ship approaching is a different problem than a pirate crew that is calm and then startled into fear. The former can be scattered or subdued with far less actual violence than the latter. The Razorleaf was, in practical terms, a way of converting the legend into operational efficiency. The whole apparatus, the name, the suit, the ship, the lair, the pattern of operations, was designed to make her larger than any single person could be, to solve, through symbolism and psychology, the fundamental problem of one person trying to matter in a conflict that vastly outnumbers them. That she succeeded as completely as she did is a testament to how thoroughly she understood the thing she was designing. But it also required something that no amount of engineering could substitute for. She actually had to go out and do the work. The fear doesn't sustain itself on rumors alone. It requires incidents, real encounters, real consequences, real evidence that the story is grounded in something that has actually happened. She had to be the Mantis, not just build the Mantis, for enough years and enough encounters that the legend had the substrate of genuine events beneath it. And that is where the cost begins to show. Doriane Voclaine was not a public figure. His name doesn't appear in the records of any of the major factions in the settled systems, doesn't surface in the archives of the UC or the Freestar Collective or any of the journalism that traces the edges of criminal activity across the colonies. What makes him significant is not anything he chose to do as an act of legacy or duty. It is something considerably more ordinary and considerably sadder. He came to his mother's lair to claim what she left him in her will, didn't know who she was until he got there, and died before he could get the rest of the way through. His recordings in the lair, made as he descended while the spacers he had hired to help him fought through the corridors ahead, are not the reflections of a man honoring a parent he understood. They are the recordings of someone learning in real time that the person he thought he knew was someone else entirely. Leon grew up well off, his mother's vigilante work funding a comfortable life, whose source he had been curious about and perhaps suspicious of. He had stopped talking to her years before her death. He came to the lair not out of love or mission, but out of estrangement and inheritance. The specific complicated combination of someone who has unresolved business with a parent they can no longer resolve it with. The spacers he hired to help him breach the base are the enemies any newcomer to the lair has to fight through. There is a particular gravity to that detail. The son of the Mantis arrived at his mother's home with a paid crew, treating the entrance like a vault to be cracked, the defenses like a logistical problem rather than a message. And as he went deeper, listening to her recordings on the intercoms, he started to understand what he had walked into, that the Mantis was not a fairy tale, that the woman who had always been able to handle herself in a fight, whose money had never had a fully satisfying explanation, had been living a second life in the dark between worlds for as long as he could remember. He made it almost all the way through. His body is found at the threshold of the puzzle room, close enough to the final test that you understand he got further than almost anyone else who tried. What stopped him was the floor, the letters, the word he needed to step through to reach the other side. Tyrannis, from Sic Semper Tyrannis, the phrase his mother apparently said to him so often, so persistently, that he recorded his own exasperation with it somewhere on the way down. He had heard those words hundreds of times. He knew the phrase. He just didn't make the connection between his mother's catchphrase and the letters laid into the floor of the room that was supposed to be the final gate between him and everything she had wanted him to have. The turrets did the rest. There is something almost unbearable about the specificity of that failure. The lair was designed for Leon. The recordings on the intercoms were addressed to him. The puzzle was built around his mother's most characteristic phrase, the thing she kept saying to him, maybe partly because she hoped it would lodge somewhere in him, that he would carry it forward even if he didn't know why. She built the key out of something she had given him over and over throughout his life, and the gap between the phrase he knew and the letters on the floor turned out to be exactly the width of all the distance that had grown between them. The inheritance Doriane built for her son was the most deliberate thing about her. Not the lair, not the armor, not the Razorleaf. The idea that Leon could take this up, that the Mantis could survive her, that her work could continue in someone she had raised, someone who had watched her from across a dinner table and been shaped, however partially, by what she was. That idea was the foundation of everything. She built the test around trust in him. And in the end, it was a trust he couldn't quite meet, not because he was unworthy, but because the years of estrangement had put too much space between them, and the phrase she had used as a kind of private watchword had never fully landed as the thing she perhaps intended it to be. Standing in the lair, after the floor and the traps and the long corridor, through what amounts to the whole accumulated defense of a private war, standing there with the suit on its display, and the Razorleaf waiting in the bay, and the recordings playing their steady, organized account of everything that happened here. You are holding something that is considerably heavier than it looks. The armor, physically, is extraordinary. The engineering is precise in the way that all the engineering in this facility is precise. Every component serving multiple functions, the whole design balanced between protection and the specific aesthetic effect she needed it to produce. But wearing it does something that the physical specifications don't fully account for. When you put on the Mantis suit, you are not equipping yourself with gear. You are stepping into a role that was written by someone else, built for a specific heir who didn't survive the test, and left in a display case on a moon that almost no one has ever found, waiting because there was nothing else for it to do. The spacers and pirates who encounter someone in that armor do not see a person. They see the myth, the entity that circulates in whispers, that gets spoken about in careful voices in the worst corners of the settled systems, that has been accumulating fear like interest across the years since the original Mantis last flew. They respond to it with the fear that was engineered into that name long before any of them were alive. The legend does the work before a single word is exchanged. This is the design functioning exactly as intended. The Mantis was never meant to be a single person. She was meant to be an idea that could occupy a single person at any given time, transmissible, persistent, independent of any particular host's lifespan. What the woman who built it created was not a vigilante operation. It was an identity that could be passed on the way a language or a tradition gets passed on, through deliberate transmission to someone willing to inhabit it fully, who then becomes its new carrier until the moment arrives to transmit it again. That the transmission skipped a generation, that the person who puts on the armor is not Doriane's son, but a stranger who followed a dead spacer's note to an airless moon, is, in the logic of the design, almost beside the point. The selection mechanism still worked. Someone got through the Lair. Someone passed the test that Leon couldn't. Whether Doriane would have chosen this particular outcome is a question worth sitting with. She built this for her son, and it's worth holding that fact carefully, not setting it aside. But the design itself does not distinguish between intended heir and unexpected inheritor. It selects for attention, for seriousness, for the willingness to listen to a dead woman's voice on an intercom and actually hear what she's saying. The Razorleaf, flying through a system where its profile is known, does something that very few ships in the settled systems can do. It precedes itself. News of the Mantis's presence in a system travels through criminal networks faster than most official communications travel through legitimate ones, because fear is a highly efficient transmission medium. A pirate crew that gets word the Razorleaf has been sighted 2 systems over is a different crew than they were before that word arrived. The calculus of what is worth attempting has shifted. The number of targets they will choose not to attack, the number of confrontations they will choose to avoid, has increased. The protection that shift produces is real and measurable in negative space, in the attacks that don't happen, the ships that don't get boarded, the colonists on small stations in the outer systems who go about their lives without knowing that a legend is running interference for them from a distance. That is what she built. That is what the armor and the ship and the word on the floor were all in service of from the very beginning. The fact that the person who ultimately steps into it is not the person she designed it for, not Leon, not the heir she imagined, doesn't diminish the design. It may, in a way that is hard to articulate without sounding callous about Leon's death, validate it. The Lair outlasted everyone who knew about it. The test still ran. The threshold still held. Taking it up is not a simple thing. The weight of it is not the weight of the suit. That is manageable. The weight of it is the weight of understanding what it was built for and what it has cost everyone who has been near it. The woman who built it paid with her ordinary life, with the complete inhabitation of her circumstances that most people experience as simply existing, and which she sacrificed to the project. Leon paid with something more immediate and more final. He paid with the gap between a phrase he had heard 100 times and the letters on a floor he couldn't quite read in time. And whoever steps into the armor after him pays with something harder to name, a kind of responsibility that doesn't come with a map, that requires the same daily recommitment to something expensive that she demonstrated across the years of her work. The settled systems are vast, and the darkness between worlds is real and deep, and has not become less dark simply because civilization has expanded into it. The spacers still operate. The Crimson Fleet still runs its networks. The space between colony worlds is still largely beyond the reach of any formal law enforcement, for the same structural reasons it always was. The distance is too great. The resources required to patrol it genuinely are too enormous, and the criminal organizations that thrive in that space understand their environment too well to be easily displaced by conventional means. The conditions that produce the Mantis are still in place. The need that she identified for something that can operate across that kind of distance, that can be in many places at once through the imagination of the people it needs to affect, is still real. The Lair is still there. The suit is still in the display case. The work is still the right kind of work for the problem it was designed to address. Somewhere on Denebola I-b, in a facility that exists below the threshold of most navigation databases and entirely below the threshold of public knowledge, the floor still spells out its word. The automated defenses still cycle through their routines. The recordings still play for whoever has followed the trail far enough to hear them. Tyrannis, step by step across the threshold, letter by letter, and enter the kingdom of the person who named her enemy and built her home around that name. The story of the Mantis is not, finally, a story about a vigilante. It is not a story about a particularly effective individual working outside sanctioned institutions to address a real and pressing problem. Those things are all present, and they are all true, but they are the surface of something that goes considerably deeper. What the Mantis story is actually about is the question of what it takes to matter in a world structured to make individual action seem insufficient. In a universe of this scale, the settled systems spread across multiple star systems, with all the dark space that implies, with criminal networks that have evolved precisely to exploit the gaps between what civilization can reach and what it can't. What does one person do? She answered that question not by making herself larger than she was, but by making the idea of herself larger. By understanding that in the particular landscape she was operating in, where the dominant psychological fact is uncertainty, where most actors are making decisions based on incomplete information and significant fear of what they don't know, the most powerful intervention is not direct force, but the modification of that uncertainty, making herself into something that exists in the imagination of her targets rather than simply in physical space, gave her a reach that no individual could achieve by conventional means. The word on the floor is, in this light, something more than a security measure or a philosophical statement. It is the declaration of a method. She named the enemy precisely and built her work around that precision. She did not allow herself the comfortable distance of operating against an abstraction, evil or crime or injustice in its shapeless general form. She named the specific shape of the wrong, tyranny, in its Roman specificity, the corruption of authority into something that consumes rather than protects. And she spelled it out underfoot, so that every time she crossed her own threshold, she was reminded of exactly what she was crossing it toward. The return to that question we began with: what kind of person builds a myth out of themselves? Now looks different than it did at the start. Not the psychology of ambition or ego or even idealism in the conventional sense. The psychology of someone who has done the work of understanding a problem with unusual clarity and arrived at the conclusion that the only tool adequate to the problem is one that doesn't yet exist, and that building it will require using themselves as the raw material. That is not a heroic identity in the comfortable sense. It is an identity constructed out of clear-eyed sacrifice, the willingness to give up the ordinary richness of a life in exchange for the possibility of mattering in a way that outlasts you, to build something worth inheriting, to trust that the person you're building it for will be ready when the moment comes. She built it for Leon. He wasn't ready. Or perhaps more accurately, the distance between them had grown too wide, and the test she designed assumed a closeness, a familiarity with her voice, her habits, her particular way of naming what she was fighting, that the estrangement had eroded. The gap between Sic Semper Tyrannis and the letters on the floor was not large, but it was exactly the size of everything that had gone unsaid between them for years. And yet the Lair held, and the suit waited, and the Razorleaf stayed in its bay on an airless moon in the Denebola system, and somewhere out in the settled systems, someone eventually picked up a note from a dead spacer's pocket and followed it to the end. The legend of the Mantis is still traveling, from pirate mouth to terrified ear, from a dead spacer's pocket to the hands of someone curious enough to follow it to Denebola, from a dead woman's voice on an intercom to whoever stands in that lair long enough to understand what they're hearing. The stars remember the Mantis, and in remembering her, they keep her present in the only way that ever really mattered, not as a person, which she was and which she is gone, but as a possibility, a shape that someone could still choose to inhabit, a word on a floor that opens a door if you've done the work to read it. She built a myth to fight tyranny. She spelled the word into the stone of her home. The dark between worlds is still wide. The story is still traveling. And somewhere, someone is stepping across the threshold, letter by letter, and deciding whether to pick up what was left for them.